Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of academic reading and writing. The topic of today's lecture is what is critical thinking. I'm your teacher Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Kohat University of Science and Technology. Dear students, agenda for today's class is that first of all, I will give you the definition of critical thinking and we will discuss John Dewey's definition in which he names critical thinking as reflective thinking. After this initial discussion on reflective thinking, then we will break down critical thinking as an active process. And we will further explore the different dimensions of critical thinking discussed in John Dewey's definition. Later on, we will discuss Glazer's definition of critical thinking, and we will also break down critical thinking into thinking skills, and these very skills are deduced from the definition of Glazer. In the second part of this lecture, I will give you a practice exercise. But before giving you the practice exercise of critical reading, I will give you some of the initial information about the essential components which we explore during our reading. And in the same discussion, we will also look at the definition of fact. And after this we will study that passage from which you have to answer different questions. I have also given you the answers of the questions which I have asked from you in this lecture, and when you will match those answers with the answers which I have given, it will help you to grade yourself in your reading comprehension. So starting from John Dewey's definition of critical thinking. John Dewey is basically an American philosopher, and he is also a psychologist and educator. So the most important thing about John Dewey is that he is widely regarded as the father of modern critical thinking tradition. Though we have a long history of critical thinking, the concept of critical thinking is not a new concept, and it has a long history. Even we see that Greek and Roman philosophers were very openly discussing the concepts of critical thinking in their time period. But in modern time period, we see that the modern way of defining and studying critical thinking, that is often regarded as that this very modern discussion of critical or reflective thinking was started by John Dewey in America. As I already told you that he called critical thinking reflective thinking, and he defines this very term reflective thinking as an active, persistent and careful consideration of a belief or a supposed form of knowledge. And he do all this thing in the light of the grounds which support it and the further conclusions to which it tends. So we can divide this very definition into three parts. In the first part, we see that John Dewey is saying that reflective thinking is active, persistent and careful consideration. And in the second part, we see that he is talking about the beliefs and supposed form of the knowledge. And then he says that these very considerations of belief or supposed form of knowledge is in the light of the grounds which support it. And in the end, we see that when we are actively or persistently considering beliefs and we think about the grounds or the reasons which support it, then we come towards the conclusions. And these conclusions further explains that what are the inclinations or tendencies. So let's break down this very definition. We see that John Dewey defines critical thinking as an active process. So basically he is contrasting critical thinking with the kind of thinking in which the reader or the one who is on the receiver end, he just receives ideas and information from someone else. So what we might reasonably call a passive process. If the person who is at the receiver end, he is just receiving ideas and information from someone, so it means that he is passively receiving that very information, or he is actually passive receiver. In contrast to that, we see that an active process is that process in which we see that the reader or the person who is receiving ideas or information, he thinks about the things that are coming into his knowledge. He or she is thinking about that very thing. And the second important step in critical thinking, when we take it as an active process, is that when we are actively thinking, actually we raise questions. And the third step is that we try to find relevant information. So an active process is the one in which reader thinks, raises questions, and find relevant information, instead of learning in a largely passive way from someone else. So in active critical thinking, the reader thinks about the information that comes to him, and he is very much critical about that. Now let's further explore the definition of John Dewey. According to John Dewey, critical thinking is persistent and careful action. So what does he want to define here is that critical thinking is something that is very different from unreflective thinking. He contrasts it with the kind of unreflective thinking, and most of the time we are doing unreflective thinking. For example, when we conclude something, or when we jump to a conclusion, or we make a snap decision, or without thinking about the different complications or different results of that decision, we are unreflectively thinking. So why we do such type of hasty or unreflective decisions? Because we need to decide quickly, or the issue is not important enough to demand the careful thought. And critical thinking demands a very persistent and careful action. So instead of doing hasty decisions or making snap decisions or deciding things very quickly without careful thought, that is the process which we normally do in our daily life. We should stop and think about our decisions, and we have to remain persistent about that very thing. And from the word persist, I mean that we should continue revising our decisions. We should continuously think about the actions or the decisions which we are taking. Now let's further explore John Dewey's definition. And the most important thing about his definition is in that part of his definition, in what he says about the grounds which support a belief. And the last part of his definition is that the further conclusions to which it tends. So in simple words, here John Dewey is saying that reason we have for believing something, or the reasons behind our beliefs and the implications of our beliefs, these are very important. When we start believing something, it actually affects our conclusions or our tendencies, or even the inclinations of a human being when we establish a belief. Because once you start believing something, it turns into the faith. And often we see that it becomes very difficult to go against the beliefs which are there established in our mind. So what are the reasons behind those beliefs? Discussing those reasons is very important. So it is no exaggeration to say that critical thinking attaches huge importance to the reasoning. Reasoning is very important concept in critical thinking, because reasoning is a way of thinking. We analyze things when we are reasoning, and it gives the logic for our actions. So when we are reasoning, we are calculating all the things, and we are thinking about all positive sides and negative sides of that very action or decision. So reasoning is very important, and we can explain this very concept as to give reason and to evaluate reasoning as well. It is very important according to John Dewey. So there is more to it than that, but a skillful reasoning is a key element in thinking process. So skillful reasoning has a strong influence in molding the thinking process. So there is no exaggeration to say this very thing, that there is great importance of reasoning in critical thinking. Now let's move towards the second definition of critical thinking, and this is the definition of Glaser. And Glaser defines critical thinking as an attitude of being disposed. From disposed, he means willing to consider in a thoughtful way. And what we are going to consider? The problems and the subjects that come within the range of one's experience. It means that whatever you experience, whatever problem or whatever issue or whatever subject that comes in your way, if you have an attitude in which you are willing to consider that problem and subject in thoughtful way, then it means that you are critically thinking. The second part of Glaser's definition is that knowledge of the method of logical inquiry and reasoning. That is the second important aspect of Glaser's definition. The first is the attitude is very important, and the willingness of that very person is very important to consider the problems and subject in thoughtful way. And the second thing is the knowledge of the logical inquiry and reasoning is very important. And the third part of the Glaser's definition is that a critical thinker needs some skill in applying those methods. So critical thinking calls for persistent effort to examine any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the evidence. So this very part is very close to the John Dewey's definition, and we see that here again Glaser is referring to that persistent effort to examine any belief or supposed form of the knowledge. Here he has used the similar words which Dewey has used. In the Dewey's definition, we see that critical thinking or reflective thinking is something where the reader is actively or persistently doing that very action. Here he is saying that it is an effort, and it is not a simple effort, it is persistent effort to examine any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the evidence. So there we have the words in which Dewey says that in the light of the grounds which support it. But here he is very clearly explaining that what type of grounds are there in the light of the evidence that supports that belief or supposed form of the knowledge, and the further conclusions to which it tends. The last part is very much similar, that as a result of that critical thinking, what conclusions are being drawn by the critical thinker, and what type of tendencies or inclinations he or she develops after this very process of critical thinking. So the definition of Glaser owes a lot to the original definition of John Dewey. Now let's break down the definition of Glaser, and it is very obvious that this definition has borrowed a lot from Dewey's definition, and here we see that Glaser refers to the evidence in place of ground. Dewey has used the word grounds. Glaser has used the word evidence in place of grounds. Otherwise, the second sentence is very much same. Though the first sentence speaks about an attitude or disposition to be thoughtful about problems, and recognizes that you can apply what he calls method of logical inquiry and reasoning with more or less skill. So not only the knowledge of the logical inquiry or reasoning is important, the skill of using these very logical inquiry and reason is very important. Now let's move towards the thinking skills. What are the thinking skills? And Edward Glaser listed the following abilities as thinking skills. So the first thing which he mentioned is that to recognize problems is very important. It is one of the important abilities to recognize the problems. The second thing is to find workable means for meeting those problems. If we are unable to find solutions or means for understanding those problems, then it means that we are lacking somewhere. So for moving towards the workable solutions of the problems, gathering and organizing pertinent information is very important. If we are able to gather the relevant information about that very problem or subject, then it becomes very easy for us to move towards the resolution of that issue. The fourth stage or the fourth ability is to recognize the unstated assumptions and values. It means that on the one side we have some factors that are visible to us, but it is very important to recognize the unstated assumption and values about the problem under consideration. And after that, it is very important to comprehend and use language with accuracy, clarity, and discrimination. If we are unable to comprehend and use language properly, it will again be very difficult to understand the reality of that issue. When we recognize the actual problem and we gather the pertinent information, it is very necessary to interpret that information or data in the right way. So these are the first few abilities of thinking skill. Now let's move towards the other important aspects of thinking skill, and we see that to apprise the evidence and evaluate statements is very important in thinking skills, and in the same way to recognize the existence of logical relationship between the different parts of the propositions is very important. And when we do that very thing, it is again very crucial to draw necessary conclusions and generalization from all the evaluation of the statements and evidence. When we reach the conclusions, to put to test the generalizations and conclusions which the critical thinker arrives is again very important. And from these generalizations, we have to construct one's pattern of beliefs on the basis of the experience which we received from the all above discussion. And in the end, we see that to render accurate judgments about specific things and qualities in everyday life is very important critical thinking skill. So these are some of the abilities of critical thinking that are very important according to Glaser. And in simple words, the two definitions that are being given by John Dewey and Glaser is that critical thinking or reflective thinking is an active, persistent and careful consideration of a belief or supposed form of the knowledge in the light of the grounds which support it or the evidence which support it and the further conclusions to which it tends or inclines. Now let's move towards the second part of our lecture, and that is critical reading practice. But before going into that actual practice, I will define this very process to you. And we see that critical reading is more or less a process like a crime scene investigator. And we see that the crime scene investigators in their search for truth, they do not let opinions sway them. They do not make the opinions to divert their attention. They want to know what actually happened, and for achieving their results, they collect all the tangible evidence or the real evidence that is there in the form of facts. When they collect the evidence and facts, they use these facts and evidences to draw an informed conclusions. So separating facts from opinions is essential during crime scene investigation. In the same way, we see that critical reading is also a very important skill for effective reading. When any person reads a material, he looks for the clues to understand the author's meaning. So the things which are very important in critical reading is that what is this passage about, and what is this writer saying. And the third question that is very important when we are trying to understand the author's meaning is that what is his or her message. So at times we see that it may seem like authors are trying to hide their meanings from you, but actually understanding of clues that are being provided by the author are very important for the real understanding of the meanings. So it may seem like authors are trying to hide their meanings from you, but no matter how complex a piece of writing may be, the author always leaves plenty of clues for the careful readers, and they can easily find the meanings because it is the job of a good reader, like a detective, that when you read, you open your eyes and ask the right questions. In other words, read carefully and actively to get the meanings of the author. So 5 lessons that will follow in the coming lecture, and it covers the basics of reading comprehension, and we will discuss these very basics of reading in the coming lectures also. And here we see this is the first part of critical reading practice, and in this very part we will cover the first very lesson, and that is about find the basic facts in a passage. The other important things which we will cover in the coming classes is determine the main idea of a passage, and the third thing is to determine the meanings of unfamiliar words from the context of that passage which we are reading. And the fourth important thing is that how we can distinguish between facts and opinions. So these are some of the things which we have to learn in the coming lectures, but today we are moving towards getting the essential information. Imagine for a moment that you are a detective and you have just been called to a scene of a crime. A house has been robbed. What is the first thing you should do when you arrive at that scene? I will give you three options, and you have to think about the answer of the question that what is the first thing you should do when you arrive on a crime scene. The first option is see what is on the TV, check what is in the fridge, or the third option is get the basic facts of the case. Just think about this. Yes, the answer of this very question is of course C, get the basic facts of the case. So getting the essential information or to get the basic facts of the case is very important. What happened, to whom this thing happened, when this incident happened, and where this thing happened, how did it happen, and why this happened. These are the basic facts which are very important for any detective. In the same way, we see that if you are reading a passage, you go through the similar process. The first thing you should do is establish the facts. What does this piece of writing tells you? What happens in this piece of writing? And to whom the accidents or incidents happened? And when, where, and how, or we can say that why this very thing happened. So this very process is very much similar to the process through which a detective has to pass when he is investigating anything. If you can answer these basic questions, you are on your way to really comprehending what you read. So before going into the real process of critical reading, I will define the word fact. And fact is something that you know for certain to have happened, or it is something that we know for certain to be true, or fact is something that we know for certain to exist. So these are the three important sides of a fact, that if something has happened, or something is true, or something exists, then it is a fact. Now let's move towards identifying the facts from this very passage. I have just displayed this passage for you, and you have to pause the video and read the whole passage. And the thing which is important about this passage is that you have to ask different questions from yourself. I haven't shown the questions which I have listed for you in the end of this lecture. These are the questions which you yourself have to ask when you are reading this very thing. The questions might be like, when did something happen? With whom did something happen? Or what did actually happen in this very? What is the incident, main incident that happened? And where this very incident actually happened? Mention all important facts that are there in this very passage. So what are the interesting details that are important? So you should carefully do the reading of this paragraph, and you should also consider that what are other events or connected things with the main event that are being shown in this very passage. Do you have some feelings about the event? Is there anything when you read this passage that comes to your mind? Or what do you predict to which other events this event points out something? So just pause the video and read the passage and try to answer these very questions. Hope you have read this passage to its full, and I will just show you that the first green part on Friday, October 21st at approximately 8:30. This is the when element being explained in this paragraph. Then to whom this incident happened. Here we see that Judith Renault is the woman to whom this very event happened. Where this event happened? Okay, this event happened in the cup factory, and this factory is situated at 128 Broad Street. Before that, actually what happened, the question is, and you can see that the green part refers to that a robbery happened in a factory, and the actual place where this incident happened is 128 Broad Street. I'm very quickly just analyzing the facts of this very paragraph. What a mess. What happened actually? Chairs and tables were overturned throughout the cafe area, and money was stolen. And then we see that interesting details in this passage is that the thieves attempted to open the safe as well, but they were unsuccessful. Another business was affected, and Primo Pizza, that is also situated nearby 130 in Broad Street. And how we come to know that this very shop was also affected. The reason is that we have some signs of forced entry, though we are not clear that what actually happened there. So these are some of the facts which are there. Now I'm going to give you some of the questions, and you try to answer these questions without looking at the paragraph. Pause the video and try to answer the questions. Welcome back, and the questions are in front of you. What happened to the cupcake factory? The answer of this question is that it was robbed and vandalized. The second question is, when was the crime discovered? At 8:30 a.m. on Friday, October 21st. This is the time when this very crime was discovered. The third question is, where did it happen? 128 Broad Street. Very right. And what was stolen in that robbery? Some money from the cash register. And who called the police? Yes, you are very right. Judith Renault, the owner of the cupcake factory, she called the police. And the last question is, what other businesses were affected? Possibly Primo Pizza, because we see that there are signs of forceful entry in the door of that restaurant. So these are the important questions, and I believe that you have answered all the questions in the right way. So I hope that now you will be clear about the critical thinking, because we have discussed in detail the two important definitions of the critical thinking. We also discussed the skills that are important in critical thinking, and in the end I have given you a passage, and you just identified the facts like a detective in that passage that not only gives you a good critical reading of a passage, it will help you in future, and that how you can include different facts and figures in a paragraph when you are writing a paragraph about some incident that has happened somewhere, or when you are trying to include such information into a paragraph. So Thank you very much for listening passionately. Inshallah, see you in the next lecture.